The slap cracked across the Georgia heat like a gunshot. 5,000 soldiers froze. Major Derek Vaughn had just struck a woman in uniform in front of the entire base, in front of generals, cameras, and a crowd that went dead silent in a single breath. The woman didn't fall. She didn't scream. She stood there, blood pooling at the corner of her lip, and looked at him the way people only look at someone they already know is finished. What Vaughn didn't know, what nobody on that parade ground knew, was that the nurse he'd just hit had already survived things that would have destroyed him 3 times over. If this story has you hooked already, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Emily Whitaker drove through the gates of Ironvale Military Hospital, she was running 4 minutes late, and her travel mug had leaked coffee down the front of her scrubs. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. It wasn't supposed to be. That was more or less the point. She badged through the side entrance, nodded at the security guard whose name she still hadn't learned after 6 weeks, and made it to the floor without anyone paying her particular attention. Which was fine. She'd spent the better part of the last 2 years learning how to move through spaces without being noticed, and Ironvale had been easy enough to disappear into. It was a large installation, nearly 400 beds, a trauma bay that handled overflow from 2 neighboring counties, and the kind of institutional exhaustion that settled into the walls of any hospital where the staff worked longer hours than anyone admitted out loud. She clocked in, checked the assignment board, and found herself assigned to the pre-op wing for the first half of the shift. Standard. She pulled her hair back, tied it tight, and got to work. The other nurses had their opinions about her. She knew that. In a place like Ironvale, half civilian staff, half military, people talked, and the things they said about Emily Whitaker had a particular flavor to them. That she'd been military once, briefly, and hadn't lasted. That she'd been medically separated under circumstances nobody could quite confirm, which meant everyone filled in the blanks themselves. That she was quiet in the way people were quiet when they were either hiding something or simply done caring, and nobody had been able to figure out which one applied to her. "She's burned out," one of the floor nurses, a woman named Priya, had said once. Not to Emily's face, but hospital acoustics were unforgiving, and Emily had heard it through a curtain while restocking a supply cart. "You can see it. She moves like someone who got their clock cleaned and never quite recovered." Emily had finished restocking the cart. She hadn't said anything. It wasn't worth saying anything. The pre-op wing was steady that morning. 2 scheduled procedures, a patient with complications from the previous day who needed close monitoring, and the usual low-grade chaos of IV adjustments and family members asking questions that the nursing staff couldn't legally answer in the way the family actually wanted. Emily moved through it competently, efficiently, without flourish. She caught a medication error on a chart that another nurse had flagged incorrectly. She spent 11 minutes with an elderly veteran who was anxious before his procedure, not because anyone asked her to, but because he was sitting alone and she could see his hands shaking. She didn't talk much during those 11 minutes. She sat beside him, checked his vitals, and just let him talk until his breathing slowed. That was the thing nobody at Ironvale had figured out about Emily Whitaker. She wasn't burned out. She was calibrated. There was a difference, and it was significant, but you'd have to have spent time in environments where the wrong call cost someone their life to understand what that distinction actually felt like from the inside. At 11:15, her charge nurse, a compact, serious man named Harold Skeeter, appeared at the end of the hallway and waved her over. "Whitaker, they need extra medical personnel at the Riverside Field Complex this Friday. Base ceremony, full parade, projected attendance around 5,000. Hot as hell, long standing time. They want civilian nursing staff on site for heat casualties, minor injuries, that kind of thing." Emily looked at him. "You volunteering me?" "You're on the rotation, unless you've got a reason I should pull someone else." She didn't have a reason, not one she was going to say out loud. "Fine," she said. Harold nodded and walked away, already looking at his clipboard. That was how the assignment happened. No ceremony, no particular significance. Just a name on a list and a slot to fill on a Friday in August in Georgia, when the heat index would sit somewhere above 100 degrees and a few thousand soldiers would stand in formation for hours, because that was what ceremonies required. She didn't think much about it on the drive home that evening. She picked up food from a place near her apartment, ate it at her kitchen counter, and went to bed early. Her apartment was small. She hadn't unpacked everything, and some of the boxes were still stacked in the corner of the bedroom, which she was aware was a sign of something she didn't feel like examining too closely. She slept without dreaming, or if she dreamed, she didn't remember it. Friday arrived like any other day. The Riverside Field Complex was about 40 minutes from the hospital, on the edge of the main installation, and by 7 in the morning, the temperature was already climbing toward the low 90s. Emily arrived in the medical support vehicle with 2 other nurses, a young woman named Kara, who had been at Ironvale less than a year, and an older man named Desmond, who had the permanently tired expression of someone who had done this exact thing too many times. They were assigned a tent near the eastern edge of the parade ground, stocked with IV supplies, electrolyte solutions, cooling packs, and the kind of basic trauma gear that made up the standard kit for events like this. "Should be light work," Desmond said, setting up a folding chair. "These things usually run 3 hours. Somebody passes out, maybe 2. We load them up, and they're fine." Kara was looking out at the field. "There are a lot of people." "There are always a lot of people," Desmond said. Emily didn't sit. She walked the perimeter of their assigned area, noted the positions of the other medical tents, identified the routes between the medical stations and the nearest vehicles, checked the terrain for anything that might complicate a rapid carry. She did this quietly, methodically, the way she did most things. Kara watched her for a moment with an expression somewhere between confused and impressed, then looked away. The ceremony began at 9. It was a significant event, a unit commendation, the kind of thing that drew senior officers, local officials, and families from 3 states. The speeches started, projected over loudspeakers across the field, and the crowd settled into the particular patient stillness that military ceremonies produced, a combination of discipline and resignation. The sun climbed higher. The air didn't move. Emily was standing at the edge of their station, watching the formations when she noticed it. The first soldier was in the 3rd row from the front, right side of the formation. He'd been standing at attention for roughly 90 minutes at that point. The sway was subtle. Most people would have read it as a shift in weight, a brief adjustment. Emily recognized it as something else. She'd seen it too many times. The way the body started redirecting blood from the extremities, pulling resources toward the core. The micro-movements that preceded a full systemic response to heat stress. She turned to Desmond. 3rd row, right side. Blue flag marker, about 8 soldiers in. Desmond squinted. "I don't see anything." "You will in about 2 minutes." He gave her the look people gave her sometimes. The polite, slightly dismissive one that meant they were humoring her. Emily had stopped being bothered by that look. She picked up a water bottle and started walking toward the edge of the medical boundary. The soldier dropped before she reached him. Not all at once, a stagger first, then the knees, then down. By the time the people around him reacted, Emily was already moving through the gap in the crowd, Kara behind her, trying to keep up. "Heat stroke, not heat exhaustion," Emily said, kneeling beside him. His skin was dry. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "Desmond, we need the cooling unit now, and I need someone to radio the secondary station. There's going to be more." "More?" Kara said. "This formation has been standing in direct sun for 1 hour and 40 minutes. They've got minimal water access. The humidity is sitting at 81%. Emily was already establishing IV access, her hands moving without hesitation. "This isn't isolated." There were 3 more within the next 20 minutes, not Desmond's 2. 4. Emily had called it closer than he had. She moved between them with a steadiness that didn't look like urgency but was the efficient, compressed urgency of someone who had learned in circumstances that didn't allow for visible panic. She directed Kara, coordinated with the secondary station over the radio, flagged 2 additional soldiers who hadn't collapsed yet but were showing early indicators, and got all 6 of them stabilized before the command staff standing at the platform had fully registered that there was a situation developing. It was Kara who said it afterward, while they were resupplying the station and the ceremony was winding down. "How did you know? That first one. Nobody else saw that." Emily handed her a stack of IV bags. "Hydration deficit plus sustained static posture plus heat index over 100. The math isn't complicated." "That's not what I mean," Kara said. Emily knew what she meant. She didn't answer. The aftermath of the medical response drew some attention. 6 soldiers recovered, none critically, all transported and stable. A junior officer came by the medical tent to express something that might have been gratitude, though it was delivered in the clipped, slightly uncomfortable way that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what to make of what he'd just watched. Desmond was recounting the events to someone on his phone with a level of detail that suggested he was already reframing them slightly in his direction. Emily was wiping down the supply cart when she heard the footsteps. They were the kind of footsteps that assumed space. Not fast, not slow. The deliberate pace of someone accustomed to having corridors clear around them. Major Derek Vaughn was not a tall man, but he occupied his height with the aggressive completeness of someone who had decided early in life that stature was a matter of will rather than measurement. He was in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a generic way 20 years ago, and had since settled into something harder. He wore his uniform the way certain officers wore their uniforms. Not as clothing, but as argument. He stopped in front of Emily's station. She looked up. "Your civilian nursing staff from Ironvale," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." "Whitaker." He'd looked at something. A clipboard, a tablet, something. "You were the one redirecting the medical response out there." "I was on station," she said. "I responded when soldiers went down." "You were operating outside your assigned perimeter. You were giving instructions to personnel at the secondary station, which is outside your chain." Emily set down the cloth she'd been using. "With respect, Major, the secondary station didn't have line of sight on the situation I was tracking. Someone needed to coordinate." "Someone," Vaughn repeated. He had a way of repeating words that turned them into a different kind of statement. "You're not someone, Whitaker. You're a civilian nurse on a day contract. You keep your head down, you staff your station, and if something is outside your lane, you call it up to the officer in charge." "The officer in charge was on the platform," Emily said. "During the response window, he was unavailable." "Then you wait." The words sat there between them for a moment. Kara had gone very still. "With respect, Major," Emily said, and her voice was level in a way that clearly cost her nothing. "Waiting was not a medical option for the patients I was treating." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "You got a real mouth on you for someone with your record." She didn't respond to that. "I looked you up," he said. "Medical separation, what, 3 years ago? Must have been rough. Getting pushed out of service." He tilted his head slightly. "What was it? Couldn't handle the pressure anymore? Or was it something else?" "My separation is in my record," Emily said. "If you'd like the details, I can request the file." "I don't need your file." "Then we don't have anything else to discuss." Something shifted in Vaughn's expression. It was quick. Most people would have missed it. But Emily had spent enough time around men like Vaughn to recognize the exact moment when professional irritation became something more personal. When a woman's calm became, to a certain kind of man, a provocation. "You know what your problem is?" he said. He'd stepped closer. Not dramatically, just enough. "You've got the swagger of someone who thinks she was something, past tense. You're not on active duty. You're not a soldier. You're a nurse who couldn't hold it together and ended up filing paperwork in a civilian hospital." He looked at her steadily. "Dead weight." Emily looked at him. "Open my file, Major." His face changed. "What did you say to me?" "I said open my record. If you want to have a conversation about my capabilities and my history, open the file and let's have it on the basis of what's actually in there." There were people nearby now. Not a crowd, but enough. A cluster of officers who'd been passing, some support staff. 2 military police positioned near the medical perimeter. Kara was standing frozen with a bag of saline she'd stopped pretending to organize. Vaughn stepped forward. "You want to tell me how to do my job?" he said, low, the kind of low that was its own kind of loud. "I'm telling you to look at the record before you decide what I am." Later, nobody would be entirely able to explain what happened next, not in a way that made full rational sense. Derek Vaughn had had a long morning, a ceremony that had gone sideways, junior officers who'd fumbled the response, and now a civilian nurse with a flat, unmoved expression looking at him like he was simply incorrect. And something in the specific shape of that moment, the calm, the crowd, the repetition of a request he couldn't fulfill without losing something he hadn't identified yet, snapped whatever he'd been holding in place. His hand came up fast. The sound of the slap crossed the entire medical perimeter. Kara made a sound she immediately suppressed. Someone nearby said something that wasn't quite a word. The 2 military police officers went rigid in the way trained personnel went rigid when the situation had just jumped 3 categories of severity in under a second. Emily's head had turned with the impact. Not dramatically. Her body hadn't moved, she hadn't staggered, she hadn't gone down. Her head turned, and then it turned back. There was a mark across her cheek. Her eyes were dry. Her expression had not in any visible way changed. She looked at Major Derek Vaughn with the absolute stillness of someone who had been in situations that made this one, in certain technical senses, very small. And then she said quietly enough that only the people closest to them heard it, though it would be repeated later and accurately. You just made a very serious mistake. 5,000 people had not seen it, but enough had. The 2 MPs were already moving. The MPs moved fast, but Vaughn moved faster. Not away, not toward Emily, but sideways into damage control, the instinctive lateral shift of a man who had survived inside institutions long enough to know that the first 60 seconds after a catastrophic error were the ones that mattered most. "Stand down," he said to the approaching officers. Not loud, measured. The voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a personnel matter. Stand down." The MPs slowed but didn't stop. They looked at each other. The hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough for it to mean something, short enough that Vaughn could pretend it hadn't happened. Emily had not moved. There was a mark across the left side of her face, red and flat, the kind that didn't swell immediately but would. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing. Her hands were at her sides. If anyone in the crowd that had gathered, 20, maybe 25 people now, with more drifting toward the edge of the medical perimeter to see what had produced that sound, if anyone expected her to cry, or shout, or do something that would give the moment a more familiar shape, they were about to be disappointed. She turned to the nearest MP. His nameplate read Dornell. "You witnessed that?" she asked. Dornell looked at her, then at Vaughn, then back at her. He was young, mid-20s maybe, and the specific situation he'd just been placed in had clearly not been covered in any training scenario with adequate detail. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for an action right now. I'm asking if you witnessed physical contact between this officer and my person. Yes or no?" A beat. "Yes, ma'am." Vaughn's voice came in over that like a blade. "Corporal Dornell, you are not required to—" "He's required to tell the truth if asked by an investigating authority," Emily said, still not looking at Vaughn, "which I intend to contact within the next 10 minutes. Now she looked at Vaughn. "So I'll ask you one more time, Major, and this time I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want me to request my personnel file through official channels? Or would you like to explain to whoever shows up here in the next hour why you struck a civilian contractor on a federal installation in front of witnesses?" Vaughn stared at her. His face had gone through several things in the last 30 seconds. The thing it settled on wasn't rage anymore. It was something closer to recalculation. The expression of a man who had just realized the ground he was standing on was different from the ground he thought he'd been standing on, and was trying to figure out how different without letting anyone see him figuring it out. "You're making a significant mistake," he said. "You already made it," Emily said. "I'm just deciding what to do about it." She picked up her radio from the supply cart and walked to the far side of the medical tent. Kara was frozen near the IV rack, holding a bag of saline she had apparently forgotten existed. Desmond had appeared from somewhere and was standing with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had seen enough institutional situations to understand that the smartest thing he could do right now was witness everything and say nothing. Emily keyed the radio to the installation command frequency. Her voice, when she spoke into it, was completely flat. "This is civilian medical contractor Whitaker, badge number C7741, calling from the Riverside Field Medical East Station. I need to report a physical altercation involving a senior officer and request the presence of the installation's Equal Opportunity Officer and Military Police Command. I have witnesses. Please advise on procedure." The radio crackled. A pause. Then, "Copy that, Whitaker. Can you confirm the nature of the altercation?" "I was struck across the face by Major Derek Vaughn of the 34th Support Brigade. The contact was witnessed by at least 2 military police personnel and multiple bystanders. I am not injured beyond superficial impact. I am requesting a formal report be initiated." Another pause. Longer. "Copy. Stand by." She set the radio down. Vaughn had not left. That was the thing. He had stayed, which meant either he didn't believe she'd actually done what she'd just done, or he'd decided that leaving now would look worse than staying. He was standing maybe 15 feet from the tent, arms folded, jaw set, with two junior officers hovering near him at a distance that communicated they didn't know what to do with themselves. Emily sat down in one of the folding chairs and pressed a cooling pack against her cheek. Not dramatically, just because it was the medically appropriate thing to do, and she was a nurse. Kara finally set down the saline bag. She came over and crouched next to Emily's chair. "Are you okay?" she said, low. "Yes. That was... he just..." Kara stopped, restarted. "Do you want me to do anything?" "Document what you saw while it's fresh. Time, location, what was said, what happened, sequence of events. Write it on anything. Text it to yourself if you have to. Don't discuss it with anyone else yet." Kara pulled out her phone immediately. Emily watched her start typing and then looked away. The ceremony had officially ended sometime during all of this. The loudspeakers had gone quiet, the formations had broken, and the crowd was dispersing in the way crowds dispersed when something had happened that nobody had officially been told about yet. Word traveled through a military installation the way it traveled through any closed community: fast, distorted, and selectively. By the time the military police commander arrived at the East Medical Station 22 minutes later, the version of events circulating among the junior enlisted had already acquired several additional details that had not occurred. The MP commander was a stocky woman named Captain Renata Foss, and she arrived with a sergeant and a tablet and the expression of someone who had been briefed on the situation in transit and was working to keep her face neutral while her brain processed the full weight of it. She asked Emily to walk her through what happened. Emily did, in order, without editorializing. Then Foss walked over to Vaughn. Emily couldn't hear that conversation from where she was sitting, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Vaughn was talking more than Foss was. Foss was nodding in the specific way people nodded when they were listening and forming conclusions that the speaker would not like. At one point, Vaughn gestured toward Emily's tent, and Foss turned to look, and Emily looked back at her without expression. When Foss returned, she asked one more question. "Ms. Whitaker, are you aware that Major Vaughn is claiming the contact was, and I'm quoting him here, incidental and the result of him gesturing during an animated discussion?" "Corporal Dornell was 2 meters away," Emily said. "Kara Ellison was approximately 4 meters. Desmond Fry was near the rear of the tent. There were additional observers I can identify if needed. I'd recommend talking to all of them separately before you talk to them jointly." Foss looked at her for a moment. "That's a very specific procedural suggestion." "I've had some experience with how these things get muddled," Emily said. Foss wrote something on her tablet. "I'm going to need a formal statement from you today, and I'm going to need you to remain available while we speak with the witnesses." "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said. What followed was 3 hours that moved with the specific grinding pace of institutional process. Statements taken, forms completed, the establishment of a chain of custody for the radio recording which, it turned out, the installation command frequency automatically archived, a detail that nobody in Vaughn's orbit had apparently considered when he'd decided to call it an incidental gesture. Emily sat through all of it with the patience of someone who understood that this particular kind of fight was not won quickly and was not won loudly. She was driven back to Ironvale that evening in a base vehicle because Captain Foss had decided Emily shouldn't be in the medical transport with Desmond and Kara until all statements were fully processed. It was a reasonable procedural call. Emily didn't argue with it. She sat in the back seat and watched the Georgia landscape go by in the last of the afternoon light. Flat scrub pine, red clay shoulders, the occasional water tower. And didn't think about anything in particular. The driver was a specialist who had clearly been told not to engage. He didn't. She was home by 8. She made tea, she didn't drink, showered, and sat on her bed in the dark for a while. The mark on her cheek had bloomed into something more visible now. Not severe, but there. She looked at it in the bathroom mirror once, clinically, the way she looked at injuries. Then she went to bed. She did not, as far as she could tell, feel triumphant. She didn't feel much of anything yet, which she recognized as a familiar state. The feeling would come later, when the machinery had run its course enough to make the outcome real. For now, there was just the fact of what had happened, and the fact of what was coming, and the specific kind of stillness she'd learned to inhabit between those two things. She slept. Harold Skeeter called her at 6:45 the next morning. "I've been briefed," he said. He had the voice of a man choosing his words with the care of someone navigating a minefield while carrying something fragile. Are you all right? Yes. Administration is aware there's a process. I know. They're pulling you from clinical rotation today. Paid administrative leave while the investigation runs. That's protocol, it's not a judgment about what happened. Emily was quiet for a moment. Okay. Emily. A pause. He almost never used her first name. Is there anything you need from this end? No, she said. Thank you, Harold. She spent the day in her apartment. She answered a call from a military investigator. Not Foss this time, someone from a higher level, which told her something about how the report had been escalated and provided additional details she'd been asked to prepare. She received a call from a JAG attorney who introduced herself as someone assigned to advise Emily on her rights during the process. And Emily listened carefully and asked questions that seemed to surprise the attorney slightly. You know a fair amount about military legal procedure for a civilian nurse, the attorney said. I read, Emily said. In the late afternoon, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she'd never fully unpacked, the one where certain things had been sitting in a manila envelope for 3 years, and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she closed the drawer. The call she got that evening was from a number she didn't recognize, which was unusual enough that she almost didn't answer. She answered on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was a man's, older, a particular cadence to it that she identified before she consciously identified it, the way the body sometimes recognized things before the mind caught up. Whitaker, the voice said. It's Aldrin. She sat up straighter without meaning to. Colonel Marcus Aldrin. Retired. The man who had commanded the unit she'd served in before her medical separation. A unit whose operational history was, officially, largely classified. He hadn't called her in 2 years. She hadn't expected him to. Colonel, she said. I heard, he said. Don't say anything about the specifics. I know you know better, but I want to say it anyway. I know. You reported through proper channels? Immediately. Good. A breath on the line. Vaughn's going to come at this sideways. You understand that. He's got people, and the people he's got have been running interference on complaints in that command for a long time. This is not going to be a clean process. I didn't expect it to be. No, Aldrin said. I don't suppose you did. Another pause. There are people who are aware of your record, Emily. Your full record. If this investigation goes where I think it might go, and it might go further than just Vaughn, those people may become relevant. She didn't answer right away. Are you telling me something is already in motion? She said carefully. I'm telling you that what happened at Riverside Field yesterday was not the first time that man has done something like this. The difference is that this time there are witnesses, a recording, and you. He let that sit for a moment. Don't disappear on me. I wasn't planning to. Good night, Whitaker. He hung up. She set the phone down and sat with the specific weight of that conversation, turning it over, parsing the parts that were stated and the parts that were implied. Aldrin was not a man who called to offer comfort. He was a man who called when something was already moving, and he wanted to make sure the people he'd trained were positioned correctly. The next 2 days were quiet, in the way that things were quiet when institutional machinery was turning somewhere you couldn't see. She got another call from the JAG attorney, briefer this time, confirming that formal charges had been filed against Vaughn for physical assault under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That confirmation arrived on a Tuesday morning while Emily was sitting at her kitchen counter with coffee, and she read the notification twice before setting her phone face down on the counter. Article 128. Assault consummated by battery. It wasn't the most serious charge that could follow from what had happened, but it was real, and it was documented, and it had the weight of something official now behind it. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know until Thursday, when Captain Foss called her back with a tone that was carefully professional in the way people were carefully professional when they were sitting on something significant, was that in reviewing the installation's radio archives for the date of the incident, investigators had found something they hadn't been looking for. Miss Whitaker, Foss said, I need to ask you a few follow-up questions, and I want to be transparent with you. The scope of our inquiry has expanded somewhat. What kind of expansion? Emily asked. A pause that lasted 1 second too long to be casual. The kind, Foss said, that involves people above my pay grade. Emily said nothing. There's a... Foss stopped, started again. There have been previous complaints filed against Major Vaughn. Multiple complaints over a period of approximately 4 years. Most of them were reviewed and closed at the installation level without being escalated. One of the investigators looking at the radio archives found a communication pattern that suggests some of those closures may not have been procedurally clean. You're telling me the complaints were buried, Emily said. Foss's voice was very measured. I'm telling you the investigation has expanded. I'm not in a position to characterize conclusions that haven't been formally reached. But you're calling me at 7:30 in the morning. A breath. Yes. Because something came up that you think I should know about before it becomes more public. I'm calling, Foss said carefully, because in the course of reviewing archived communications related to the current complaint, investigators came across documentation indicating that Major Vaughn made a request, approximately 3 years ago, to have a specific personnel file reclassified and access restricted at the installation level. She paused. The file belonged to a contractor with the surname Whitaker. Emily was very still. He requested it 3 years ago, she said. Yes. Before I was assigned to Iron Vale. The request predates your civilian employment there by about 8 months. Emily set down her coffee cup because she realized her hand had developed a slight, barely perceptible tremor that she did not want to transmit through the ceramic to the counter and hear. She set it down quietly. She breathed. He knew, she said. Not a question. We don't know what he knew or how, Foss said. That's what's being investigated. But, Ms. Whitaker, I want to be direct with you. If what's in your file is what I've been given reason to believe it might be, and I want to stress I don't have clearance to access it directly, then the picture of what happened at Riverside Field may be considerably different from a senior officer losing his temper with a civilian contractor. Emily's jaw was tight. She loosened it deliberately. Captain Foss, she said, how many complaints were filed against Vaughn? A pause. 7, Foss said, that we've found so far. And all 7 were closed at the installation level. All 7. Emily looked at the wall across from her kitchen counter. There was a small water stain in the upper corner from before she moved in, and she'd been meaning to ask the landlord about it and hadn't gotten around to it. She looked at it for a moment. Who closed them? She asked. Foss's voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been. That's what we're trying to establish, she said, and I think you can see why we might be moving relatively quickly. Emily understood exactly why they were moving quickly. An assault charge with witnesses and an audio record was already a significant matter. An assault charge that was connected to a years-long pattern of buried complaints and a deliberate attempt to restrict the file of the specific civilian contractor who had filed said assault charge. That was something else. That was the kind of thing that didn't stay at the installation level. That was the kind of thing that moved upward and took people with it when it went. She thanked Foss and ended the call. She sat with the new information and let it settle into the Vaughn hadn't just been an arrogant officer who'd lost his temper at a ceremony. He'd known who she was before she ever walked through Iron Vale's gates. He'd known, or suspected, and he'd taken steps. Quiet, administrative steps. The kind that left no obvious fingerprints, to make sure that whatever was in her file stayed buried. And then, 8 months later, she'd shown up anyway, in civilian scrubs, filing into a day contract slot like any other nurse, and he'd had to decide what to do about that. What he'd done was watch her, and wait. And when she'd stood in front of him at Riverside Field and asked him calmly to open her record, something in him had broken in a direction he hadn't planned for. She stood up from the kitchen counter and went to the bottom drawer. This time, she opened it. The manila envelope was thick, thicker than it looked from the outside, because the paper inside was the dense, formatted kind that government documents were printed on, and because there were multiple layers to it, each one separated by a colored tab she'd inserted herself 3 years ago when she'd finally received the partial release of her own file after 18 months of formal requests. She'd read it enough times that she didn't need to read it again, but she spread the contents across the kitchen table anyway, because she needed to see the shape of it, the physical presence of it, the weight of the thing she'd been carrying through every ordinary Tuesday in that hospital hallway. The top page was her separation document, medical discharge, non-punitive, honorable conditions. The language was clinical and said almost nothing about the actual circumstances. That was how those documents worked, by design. The circumstances that mattered were in the pages underneath. Operational summaries, commendation records, medical performance evaluations from 3 different theaters of deployment that spanned 4 years before everything stopped. There were redactions throughout, thick black bars over unit designations, location names, the identities of other personnel. But the evaluations themselves were intact, and the language in them was not the language people used about nurses who couldn't handle pressure. Words like exceptional field judgment under direct fire. Words like demonstrated clinical precision in conditions that exceeded protocol parameters. One evaluation, written by a colonel whose name was blacked out but whose rank was not, used the phrase, "I have never seen a medical officer respond to a mass casualty situation with this level of tactical integration, and I have been in this branch for 22 years. She'd been 29 when that was written. She stacked the pages back into the envelope and sealed it. Then she called her JAG attorney. "I need to formally request that my full personnel file be submitted to the investigative body as evidentiary material," Emily said when the attorney picked up. "Not the partial release I have, the complete classified record. I want it on the table." A pause. "Emily, declassifying portions of your record could. There are protocols for that, and it takes time, and it may not—" "The investigation has already expanded," Emily said. "They found the restriction request Vaughn filed 3 years ago. If they're going to understand the full picture of why he filed it, they need to see what he was trying to restrict." She paused. "I've been waiting 3 years for that file to mean something. I'd like it to mean something now." Another pause, longer. "I'll make the request," the attorney said. "I can't guarantee the timeline." "I understand. Make the request." She hung up. She looked at the envelope on the table for another moment. Then she put it back in the drawer. The next 5 days were the strangest she'd experienced since her separation. Not because they were dramatic, but because they weren't. She was on administrative leave, which meant she had no particular place to be and no particular task to perform. And the absence of structure after years of 12-hour shifts produced a specific kind of restless clarity that she didn't entirely know what to do with. She ran in the mornings. She went to the grocery store. She answered her phone when the investigators called, which was every day now, sometimes twice. The questions were getting more specific and more technical, which told her the inquiry was drilling down into details that required context to interpret. On the 4th day, her JAG attorney called with a development. "2 former soldiers have come forward," she said, independently. "Both filed complaints against Vaughn within the last 4 years that were closed at the installation level. Both say they were contacted after their complaints were filed and discouraged from pursuing them further." "Contacted by whom?" "That's what they're being asked. One of them is being very specific. The other is less forthcoming, but the investigators believe there's more there." A beat. "Emily, there's something else. One of the soldiers, I can't give you the name yet, filed a complaint 2 years ago that included documentation, physical records. He kept copies after his complaint was closed, which is apparently not what he was told to do." "What kind of documentation?" "Communications between Vaughn and at least 2 other officers about case management." She said the phrase carefully, the way people said phrases that were stand-ins for something considerably worse. "The investigators are characterizing it as potentially significant." Emily absorbed that. "How many people knew those complaints were being closed?" "That," her attorney said, "is the question." On the 6th day, Aldrin called again. This time it was midday, and he didn't open with pleasantries. "There are people coming to see you," he said. "Not the JAG, not Foss. Higher than that. They're going to want to talk about your record in the context of the larger investigation." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. They'll contact you directly to confirm location." A pause. "Emily, when they ask you what you want out of this, I'd like you to think carefully before you answer." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's going to be a moment in that room where they offer you something in exchange for cooperation. And what they offer you will tell you something about how serious they think this has become." She thought about that for a moment. "How serious do you think it's become?" "I think," Aldrin said slowly, "that what started as a man hitting a nurse at a parade ground is turning into something that involves oversight failures at multiple command levels and potentially over a significant period of time." He paused. "I think Derek Vaughn is not the ceiling of this thing. I think he might be closer to the floor." He hung up before she could respond. She stood in her kitchen holding her phone and let that land completely. The meeting. The following morning happened not at her apartment and not at the installation, but at a federal building in the city 40 minutes north, a nondescript office suite on the third floor that could have been an insurance company and was not. There were two investigators, a woman named Special Agent Darla Trent from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and a man who introduced himself as Supervisory Agent Corfield and offered no further detail about his specific role, which was its own kind of information. They were professional in the way that investigators at that level were professional. Not warm, not cold, precise. They had a file on the table between them that was considerably thicker than anything Emily had expected. "Ms. Whitaker," Trent said, "we appreciate you coming in. I want to be direct with you about the scope of what we're working on, because I think you're someone who responds better to directness, and because frankly the situation warrants it." "Okay," Emily said. "Major Derek Vaughn has been formally charged under Article 128, you know that. What you may not know is that the investigation initiated by that charge has now expanded into an inquiry under the Inspector General's authority examining conduct within the 34th Support Brigade command structure going back approximately 6 years. Trent folded her hands on the table. "In the course of that inquiry, we've identified what appears to be a coordinated pattern of complaint suppression, administrative interference, and, in at least 2 instances, what we believe may constitute obstruction. We have communication records. We have testimony from 4 former service members with direct experience of that pattern. And we have the restriction request filed against your personnel file approximately 3 years ago, which, based on what we've been able to establish about the timeline, appears to predate your arrival at Iron Vale by a significant margin." Emily said nothing. "Your file, Ms. Whitaker," Corfield said, speaking for the first time. He had a quiet voice that didn't match his size. "We've submitted a formal request for full declassification through appropriate channels. That process takes time. But based on the partial release you possess and the evaluations that are already on record, I think you understand that your history of service is relevant to the question of why someone in Vaughn's position would have taken an active interest in restricting your record before you were even assigned to his installation." "He knew I was coming," Emily said. "We believe someone told him," Trent said. "We're working on who?" The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere below, a truck went past. "What do you need from me?" Emily asked. "We need your formal cooperation as a material witness in an expanded Inspector General investigation," Trent said, "which you are under no obligation to provide and which carries both protections and constraints that our legal team will walk you through in detail. We also," she paused, "would like to discuss your personnel file directly with you, in a context that allows us to understand the full operational history, because we believe that history is directly relevant to establishing motive in this case." Emily looked at them both. "You want me to talk about what's in the classified sections?" "With appropriate clearances in place, yes." "And in exchange?" Trent and Corfield exchanged a look that was brief enough to be invisible to most people. Emily caught it. "Your civilian contractor status and hospital access would be reinstated immediately," Trent said. "All administrative holds lifted, and the Army would issue a formal statement acknowledging that the medical separation in your record was the result of injuries sustained in the line of duty during an operation that is now partially declassified." She paused. "Which, as we understand it, has not previously been formally acknowledged." Emily was quiet for a long moment. It had not been previously acknowledged. That was accurate. The medical separation paperwork said injuries sustained. It did not say what kind or where or during what. The VA had a record. The classified sections of her file had a record. But there had been no official public-facing acknowledgement that Emily Whitaker had been medically separated because she'd taken shrapnel to her left side while pulling 3 wounded soldiers out of a compound in a place that officially didn't have American medical personnel in it, and had continued performing battlefield medicine for 47 minutes after sustaining that injury before being evacuated. No one at Iron Vale knew that. Harold Skeeter didn't know it. Priya, who had called her burned out through a curtain, didn't know it. Kara didn't know it. Desmond didn't know it. Vaughn had apparently known it, or known enough, which was why he'd tried to keep the file locked. "I'll cooperate," Emily said. The cooperation that followed was not a single meeting, but a series of them, 4, over the next 2 weeks, each one progressively more detailed and more exhausting in the specific way that being asked to recall things you've organized yourself not to think about too directly was exhausting. She talked about the operations. She talked about the injuries. She talked about the 47 minutes, though not in those terms. She talked about the medical decisions she'd made, the triage sequence, the conditions, the equipment that was available, and the equipment that wasn't. Trent took notes with a thoroughness that suggested she was going to know these events as well as Emily did by the time it was over. Between sessions, life continued in its strange, suspended state. Kara texted once, carefully, to say she'd given her formal statement and that she hoped Emily was doing okay. Emily texted back that she was fine and thanked her for documenting quickly. Harold called once to say that her reinstated access paperwork was processing. Aldrin didn't call, which she understood to mean things were moving in the direction he'd expected, and he didn't feel the need to manage her. It was on the second Thursday of that period, 12 days after the initial IG meeting, that the thing happened which shifted everything from an investigation into a full public event. She was in her apartment, going through the previous session's follow-up questions, when her phone lit up with a news notification. She almost didn't look at it. She'd been avoiding news related to the case because the early coverage had been inaccurate in ways that were going to require correction, and she didn't want the inaccurate version living in her head while she was trying to be precise with investigators. But she looked. The notification was from a regional outlet, and the headline was, "Sources, DoD IG investigation expands into 34th Support Brigade complaint suppression. Multiple officers named." She put the phone face down. It had leaked. She didn't know from where. These things always leaked, eventually. That was the nature of investigations that involved enough people and enough documents. But it had leaked, and the shape of the story that was now going to exist in the public record was going to be different from the shape it had been in before, because the public story had a particular quality that internal investigations didn't. It was permanent, and it had an audience, and it created pressure that institutional processes could resist in ways that public scrutiny made considerably harder. By the following morning, it was national. The coverage was uneven. Some outlets had more details than others. Some were connecting dots in ways that were partially right and partially extrapolated. But the core of it was accurate. An assault at a military ceremony, a civilian nurse with a classified record, a complaint pattern going back 6 years, an inspector general investigation that had started with one punch and expanded into something considerably larger. Her name was in several of the pieces. She had not spoken to any journalists and did not intend to. Her attorney called to confirm that the IG's office had issued a statement acknowledging the expanded investigation and that Emily had cooperated fully, which was a degree of public positioning on the IG's part that told her something about how confident they were in their case. What she did not expect, what nobody had specifically prepared her for, was the calls. They started coming in the third day after the story broke. Not to her directly at first, through the JAG attorney, through Iron Veil's administration, through channels that people who wanted to reach her had apparently worked to find. Former service members. 3 of them in the first week, then 6, then more. Some of them had filed complaints. Some of them hadn't. Some of them were still serving and calling from positions that made calling at all a significant personal risk, and she could hear that risk in their voices. The careful phrasing, the pauses, the way they said, "I just wanted someone to know," without being able to say quite what they wanted known. She listened to every one of them. She took notes. She forwarded the notes to her attorney, who forwarded them to the IG's office, because that was the correct procedure and procedure mattered. But she also just listened, because some of them didn't have anything evidentially useful to add to the investigation. Some of them were just people who had been told to stay quiet for a long time and had seen something on the news that made them feel like staying quiet might not be the only available option anymore. She understood that feeling. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after Riverside Field, she got a call from her attorney that was different from the others. "The declassification has been processed," the attorney said, and her voice had a quality in it that she was working to keep neutral and wasn't entirely succeeding. "Your complete service record has been released to the investigative body and will be formally entered into the evidentiary record." Emily sat down. She hadn't realized she was still standing. "And the formal acknowledgement?" "Being drafted. The Army's Public Affairs Office is coordinating with the IG. It'll be issued as part of the official case documentation. A pause. Emily, I've been doing this for 9 years. I've read a lot of personnel files. She stopped. Your record is, I want you to know that the people who read it it's not a file that leaves you unchanged. Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing for a moment. When will it go into the record formally? Friday. Okay, Emily said. Thank you. She sat on her couch after the call and looked at the wall and thought about the 47 minutes, about the first soldier she'd gotten out, a kid named something she wasn't going to say out loud, ever, because saying his name in this context felt wrong, felt like it made him part of a story that wasn't his story, it was hers. About the way the light had been in that compound, about the specific physical sensation of working with shrapnel in your side and choosing, consciously, deliberately, to continue working because the alternative was that 3 people who were still alive stopped being alive, and the math on that was not complicated even when everything else was. Nobody at Iron Vale had known she'd made that choice. Vaughn had known, or known enough to be afraid of it. On Friday morning, the record entered the evidentiary file. By Friday afternoon, someone inside the IG's office, not authorized to do so, but someone, had let enough of the details out that 2 journalists had confirmed the broad outlines of Emily's operational history and were preparing to publish. Her attorney called at 4 to warn her. The IG's office called at 4:15 to express frustration with the leak, while also, between the lines, conveying that they were not going to be able to fully contain what was now in motion. She went for a run. She ran longer than usual, 8 miles, through the neighborhoods around her apartment, past the grocery store and the park, and the water tower she could see from her kitchen window. And when she got back, she was sweating through her shirt, and her left side was aching in the specific way it sometimes ached when she pushed past a certain point, the shrapnel scar tissue that never quite stopped being a reminder of what it was. She stood on her front step and breathed. Her phone had 14 new notifications. She went inside. She showered. She made coffee this time and actually drank it. And she was sitting at her kitchen table reading through the investigative summary her attorney had sent over when the text came in from a number she recognized as one of the former soldiers who'd called in the first week, a woman named Petra, who'd served in the same general command structure as Vaughn 5 years ago and had filed a complaint that had been closed in under 2 weeks. The text said only, "They just arrested him." Emily stared at it. Her phone rang. It was her attorney. "Major Vaughn was taken into custody approximately 40 minutes ago," the attorney said. "Article 128, assault consummated by battery, plus 3 additional charges added by the IG's investigation, abuse of authority, obstruction of a military investigation, and conduct unbecoming an officer." And Emily, she paused. "He's not the only one. 2 lieutenant colonels from the 34th's command staff were served with formal notice of investigation this morning. One of them is currently cooperating with IG investigators." Emily set her coffee cup down. "One of them is talking," she said. "One of them is talking," her attorney confirmed. The thing about a system that had been held in place by mutual protection was that it was stable only until the moment it wasn't. Once one person started talking, really talking, not just the careful deflections of someone trying to minimize their own exposure, but actual cooperation with specific details and documentation, the pressure on every other person in that system changed fundamentally. Because now the calculation was no longer about protecting the group. It was about whether you were going to be the one left standing when the group stopped existing. Emily knew how this part worked. She'd seen it before, in smaller configurations, in contexts that were more immediately physical and considerably louder. The mechanics were the same. Once the structure started coming apart, it came apart faster than anyone expected, because the structure was never as solid as it appeared from the outside. It was held together by the assumption that nobody would move first. When someone moved, everything else was just momentum. She was still sitting at the kitchen table an hour later when the first news alert came through with Vaughn's name and the word arrested. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the bottom drawer, closed now, the envelope inside it, the documents she'd been carrying for 3 years through cheap apartments and 12-hour shifts, and the quiet daily indignity of being someone that people thought they already understood. She thought about the soldier in the pre-op wing, the one who'd been anxious before his procedure, whose hands had been shaking. She thought about Kara, frozen with a saline bag. She thought about Corporal Dornell and the 2 seconds he'd taken to answer honestly when the easier thing would have been to look away. She thought about the 7 complaints that had been buried. She was still thinking when her phone rang again, and this time the number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, area code she couldn't immediately place, no name attached. And something about it made her pause before answering, some instinct she'd learned to trust even when she couldn't articulate the logic behind it. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, steady, with the kind of controlled cadence that came from years of speaking in rooms where every word was measured. Ms. Whitaker, the voice said, my name is Brigadier General Constance Harwell. I'm calling because I've read your complete service record, and I need to speak with you directly about what comes next. Emily said nothing for one full second. I'm listening, she said. Good, Harwell said, because what I'm about to propose is going to require you to make a decision, and I'd like you to make it with full information rather than partial. A pause. Major Vaughn's arrest is not the end of this. Based on what the cooperating witness has provided to IG investigators in the last 6 hours, we are looking at a systemic failure of oversight that extends beyond the 34th Support Brigade and involves personnel and decisions at a level that is going to require a response from this institution that is proportional to the scope of what occurred. Another pause, shorter. And the response I'm proposing centers on you. Emily's hand tightened slightly on the phone. What kind of response? She said. The kind, Harwell said, that doesn't just punish the people who failed, the kind that tries to build something that makes it harder for this to happen again. She paused once more. I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning, Ms. Whitaker. There are people who need to meet you, people with the authority to make decisions that matter. And I think what they're going to say to you is going to be considerably different from anything you've heard from this institution in the last 3 years. Emily looked at the bottom drawer. She thought about what Aldrin had told her. What they offer you will tell you something about how serious they think this has become. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. Outside her window, the Georgia evening was settling into the particular blue-gray that preceded full dark. And somewhere in the distance, a truck engine downshifted on the highway. And the apartment was very quiet around her in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, less like emptiness and more like the specific silence before something that was about to change. Her phone lit up again. A text from a number she didn't know. 3 words, no punctuation. The kind of message that someone sends when they've been holding it for a long time and finally decide to send it at exactly the wrong moment. It said, "Don't trust Harwell." She stared at the text for a long moment. 3 words. No name, no context. And the number attached to it had no area code she could immediately place, no name her phone could pull, nothing to anchor it to a person or a purpose. It could have been a wrong number. It could have been someone trying to destabilize her the night before a meeting that apparently some people already knew about. It could have been someone who genuinely knew something. She forwarded the text to her attorney with a single line. Received this 10 minutes after Harwell called. Don't know the source, flagging for the record. Then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with the decision she'd already made, which the text hadn't changed. She would go tomorrow. She would go because not going was a choice that left her outside the room, while the room made decisions about her, and she had spent enough of the last 3 years outside rooms where decisions about her were being made. She also wasn't naive enough to go unprepared. She spent the next 2 hours doing something she hadn't done in a while, thinking tactically about information, what she knew, what she didn't know, what questions she'd ask, what she'd decline to answer without counsel present, what she needed to understand about Harwell before the meeting that she didn't currently understand. Aldrin had told her what the offer would reveal. She intended to listen to the offer with that frame clearly in place. She looked up Harwell through the IG's public documentation, the Army's official command records, the limited but real footprint that senior officers left in public-facing military records, even when their operational histories were classified. Brigadier General Constance Harwell, currently attached to Army Medical Command in a senior oversight role. 26 years of service. 2 deployments. A stint on the Army Surgeon General's staff 4 years ago. No obvious connection to the 34th Support Brigade. No obvious connection to Vaughn, which meant either she was exactly what she presented herself as, a senior officer who'd read a file and wanted to respond to what she read, or the connection was something that didn't show up in public records, which was always possible, and was exactly the kind of thing the anonymous text might have been gesturing at without being able to say directly. Emily slept badly, which she'd expected. She was up at 5, running by 5:30, back by 6:45. She ate, changed, and drove herself to the federal building for the second time, arriving 8 minutes early, which was intentional. Harwell was already there. She was shorter than Emily had expected. The rank and the voice had built a different picture. And she was sitting at the table with a posture that was neither aggressive nor deferential but simply present. The posture of someone who'd long ago stopped needing to perform authority because they simply had it. She was in uniform. She stood when Emily came in. "Miss Whitaker," she said, and extended her hand. Emily shook it and sat down. There were two other people in the room. A colonel whose name tag read Satterley and who appeared to be there primarily in a documentation capacity, and a civilian woman who introduced herself as being from the Army Surgeon General's office and didn't offer a last name, which was its own statement. Emily's JAG attorney was already in the chair to her left. Harwell didn't open with pleasantries. Emily found she appreciated that. "I'll start with what I know," Harwell said. "I've read your complete service record. I've read the IG investigation summary as of last night. I've read the statements from the cooperating witness and the additional service members who've come forward." She folded her hands on the table. "And I want to say something to you directly before we get into the purpose of this meeting, because I think it should be said by someone with rank, on the record, in a room with witnesses." Emily waited. "What was done to you? The suppression of your record, the administrative interference, the public assault, and the 3 years during which you were permitted to be characterized as someone who couldn't manage when your actual history was the opposite, was wrong. It was an institutional failure at multiple levels, and you should have a formal acknowledgement of that from someone who can speak for the institution." Harwell's eyes didn't move from Emily's. "I'm giving you that acknowledgement now." The room was quiet. Emily said, "Thank you." Not because she didn't mean it. She did mean it, more than she expected to, which surprised her slightly. But because it wasn't enough on its own, and both of them knew it, and moving to what came next was the more honest way to honor what Harwell had just said than sitting with it too long. "The text," Emily said. "Don't trust Harwell. You should know I received it." Something moved across Harwell's face. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "Do you know who sent it?" Harwell asked. "No, I forwarded it to my attorney and flagged it for the record." Harwell nodded slowly. She looked at Satterley briefly. Something passed between them that Emily filed away. "I think I know who sent it," Harwell said. "And I think explaining that will help you understand why I need your cooperation, and why some people who are currently under investigation would prefer you didn't give it." She opened the folder in front of her. "The cooperating witness from the 34th row, Lieutenant Colonel Ray Pendergrast, has been talking to investigators for 16 hours across 3 sessions. What he's provided goes considerably beyond Vaughn." She turned a page without looking down at it, which told Emily she had it memorized. "There is a network. I want to use that word carefully because it sounds like I'm implying something organized and deliberate from the start, and it wasn't, not exactly. What it was at the beginning was a group of officers in the same command structure who agreed informally to manage problems internally rather than let them escalate. Complaints about conduct, about judgment, about treatment of subordinates. They kept them quiet. They told themselves it was for unit cohesion. That was probably even true at first." Emily was very still. "At some point," Harwell continued, "it stopped being about cohesion and started being about protection, about the network itself. And the people inside it started making decisions not about what was right for the unit, but about what kept the network intact." She paused. "Vaughn was not the most senior person in that network. He was one of the more aggressive ones, and he drew the most visible attention, but he was not at the top." "Who's at the top?" Emily asked. "We're establishing that. Pendergrast has named 3 people. One of them has already engaged legal representation and is declining to cooperate. One of them retired from active duty 14 months ago and is currently being located. The third—" She stopped. "The third is still active," Emily said. "Yes. And that's who sent me the text." Harwell looked at her. "That's our working assumption. We can't confirm it yet. But the purpose of that text, whatever its source, was to make you hesitate, to make you wonder whether coming here was safe, to give you a reason not to cooperate." Emily thought about that. which means they know exactly how significant my cooperation is. Yes, Harwell said. It does. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Emily asked more questions than she answered in the first half and answered more than she asked in the second, which was roughly how she'd planned it. The civilian from the Surgeon General's office spoke for the first time about 40 minutes in, laying out a proposal that was carefully constructed and that Emily listened to with the full attention it deserved, which was considerable. She didn't agree to anything in the room. Her attorney had advised against it, and she agreed with the advice. She said she would consider the proposal and respond within 48 hours. She drove home through traffic that was worse than the morning commute and sat in it without irritation, which was itself a sign of something. She wasn't sure what. She was thinking through the shape of what she now understood, trying to find the places where it didn't fit together, because in her experience, the places where things didn't fit were the ones that mattered most. The network, the managed complaints, Vaughn as an instrument rather than an architect. She thought about the 7 complaints that had been buried. She thought about the specific energy it took to bury 7 complaints. The paperwork, the coordination, the multiple people who had to agree, or be told, or be threatened, or be quietly informed that their cooperation was part of the cost of belonging to something that had so far protected them. That was not a spontaneous thing. That was a system, and systems didn't assemble themselves. She called Aldrin from the car. "Harwell," she said when he picked up. "I know her," he said immediately. "She's legitimate. She's been trying to get traction on command culture issues in that region for 2 years and kept hitting walls. If she's in that room with you, it means she finally has enough to move. Someone texted me last night telling me not to trust her." A pause. "Who?" "Unknown number." "That's Harwell's opposition, not Harwell herself." He was quiet for a moment. "What did she propose?" Emily told him. He was quiet for longer this time. "Are you going to accept?" he finally asked. "I'm thinking." "You should think fast," he said. "The person who sent that text is not going to stay passive. They've got something at stake." She ended the call as she pulled into her parking space. She sat in the car with the engine off for a moment, looking at the front of her building, the ordinary mid-afternoon stillness of it. Aldrin was right. She needed to move. She went inside and called her attorney. "I want to formally accept the cooperation agreement," she said, "and I want to add one condition." "What condition?" "The 7 complaints. The service members who filed them and were told to drop them. I want a formal review of each case as part of the investigation, not just as background evidence for the Vaughn charges, as individual matters with individual resolutions." Her attorney was quiet for a moment. "That's going to expand the scope significantly." "Yes," Emily said. "It is." What happened next happened in the particular compressed and grinding way that things happened when institutions were under public pressure and legal pressure simultaneously. Not quickly, in the sense of feeling fast, but fast in the sense of significant things occurring in a short time frame. The cooperation agreement was formally executed on a Monday. By the following Wednesday, the IG had issued a public statement confirming that the investigation had expanded to include systemic complaint suppression within the 34th Support Brigade command structure and that additional personnel were under investigation. They did not name names in the public statement. They didn't need to. Pendergrass cooperation meant that the names were already in the investigative record, and enough had leaked through enough channels that the regional press had most of them within 48 hours. The name that appeared was Colonel Brent Oswell, retired 14 months ago. Currently located, the language in the news report was careful, at a residence in South Carolina. He had not been arrested. He had been served with notice of investigation and had issued a statement through legal representation denying knowledge of any coordinated misconduct and expressing confidence in the investigative process, which was the statement everyone issued when they knew the investigative process was going to find them regardless, and they needed to establish a paper record of cooperation that they had no intention of actually providing. Oswell. Emily didn't know the name from her own service. She ran it through everything she could access through legitimate means: public records, the military's open command histories, the IG's public documentation. He'd been the brigade commander of the 34th for 3 years before his retirement. He'd been in that role for the entirety of the period during which the complaints against Vaughn had been filed and closed. He'd been the ceiling, she told Harwell. Harwell already knew, which Emily had expected. What she hadn't expected was what Harwell told her in return. Oswell filed the original restriction request on your personnel file, Harwell said. They were on a secure call, not in person. Not Vaughn. Oswell filed it. Vaughn may not have known the specifics of your record. He may have been told to watch for your name and act accordingly if you surfaced near his installation. Emily absorbed that. He was running interference for Vaughn, she said. He was running interference for the network, Harwell said. Vaughn was one asset in it. You were a potential liability. Your history, your record, the things you'd seen and done in contexts that overlapped in complicated ways with some of the personnel decisions that had been made in that command structure. We're still working out the precise connections. But Oswell knew enough about your operational background to consider you a risk to the stability of a system he'd spent years maintaining. So everything that happened to me, Emily said slowly, the separation, the way my file was handled, Vaughn at Riverside Field, was not coincidental, Harwell said. We don't think it was coordinated from the beginning. We think your separation happened for legitimate medical reasons and was then, opportunistically, used. Someone in that system saw your record and decided that keeping it quiet and keeping you out was preferable to whatever your continued presence might eventually surface. A pause. We don't fully know yet. We're getting there. Emily sat with that for the rest of the day and most of the following morning. It was a different thing to understand, emotionally, than anything that had come before it. The assault had been visceral and immediate. The buried complaints had been enraging in a clean way. But this was something more diffuse and harder to hold. The idea that her medical separation had been used. That the thing that had ended a part of her life she'd chosen and trained for and given herself to had been turned into a tool by people who hadn't earned the right to touch it. She ran 8 miles the next morning and didn't think about anything. Then she came home and ate and answered her phone and kept moving, because that was the only thing that had ever actually worked. The public dimension of the investigation was accelerating in ways that were both useful and difficult to manage. 3 more former service members had come forward publicly, not just to investigators, but to journalists. And their accounts were detailed and consistent, and the kind of detailed consistency that was hard to construct if you were making things up. One of them had served under Vaughn directly. Another had filed a complaint 2 years ago that had been closed in 8 days. A third had been told by a superior officer that pursuing her complaint would be characterized as insubordination and result in administrative action against her. That third one, a woman named Specialist Veda Marsh, who was still active duty and had come forward at considerable personal risk, gave an interview that ran in 2 national outlets simultaneously on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon it was being referenced in a Senate Armed Services Committee statement calling for a formal congressional inquiry. Emily read Marsh's interview twice. The second time she had to put her phone down and walk to the window and stand there for a while, looking at the water tower in the distance, the ordinary middle distance of her ordinary neighborhood. Marsh had been 23 when she filed her complaint. She'd been told it was closed due to insufficient evidence, which was a category that covered a significant range of actual realities, most of them less about evidence and more about who was deciding what to do with it. She'd spent 2 years believing she'd done something wrong and how she'd handled it. She'd been in therapy. She'd considered leaving the service. Then she'd seen the news coverage and called the number in the article. Emily called her attorney. "Marsh," she said, "is she connected to any of the formal witness support structures yet?" "She's been contacted by the IG's office. She's going through their process. Is there anything preventing me from reaching out to her directly?" A pause. "You shouldn't discuss evidentiary details, but a personal contact isn't prohibited." "I'll be careful," Emily said. She didn't call Marsh that day because reaching out immediately felt like it was about Emily's need to do something rather than Marsh's need for anything specific. And she'd learned enough about her own instincts to know when they were pointing somewhere useful and when they were pointing at herself. She waited 2 days. Then she sent a message through the JAG office, asking if Marsh would be willing to speak with her. Not about the case, just to speak. Marsh said yes within an hour. They talked for 45 minutes, and Emily let Marsh do most of the talking because that was what the conversation required. And at the end, Marsh said something that Emily didn't have an immediate answer for. "Did you know it was going to get this big?" Marsh asked. "When you made the call at Riverside Field. Did you know?" Emily thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I made the report because it was the correct thing to do. I didn't know what would happen after." But you weren't surprised. Emily considered that. No, she said. I wasn't surprised. The first formal legal proceeding happened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Riverside Field. It was not a trial. It was a preliminary Article 32 hearing, the military equivalent of a grand jury process, examining the charges against Vaughn and determining whether they were sufficient to proceed to court-martial. Emily was not required to appear in person. Her formal statement and the audio record from the installation's communication archive were submitted as evidence. Dornell testified. Kara testified. Desmond testified, and his account, filtered through his characteristic desire to place himself at the center of events, was still useful enough to matter. Vaughn appeared in dress uniform, and the photographs from outside the hearing room ran in several outlets that afternoon. He looked smaller than the photographs Emily had seen from earlier in his career, which was not a physical thing. He was the same height, the same frame, but was something about the specific way a person occupied their body when the authority that had structured that occupation was being systematically removed. The Article 32 hearing recommended proceeding to court-martial. The recommendation was not a surprise. What came the following day was, Harwell called at 8 in the morning. Oswell's legal team reached out to the IG's office last night, she said. He's offering to cooperate. Emily was quiet. He's scared, Harwell said. The congressional inquiry announcement changed the calculation. When it was an IG investigation, he could reasonably expect to manage his exposure through legal maneuvering and a retirement that was already complete. A congressional inquiry has a different audience and different powers. What's he offering? Full account of the network structure, names, timelines, specific decisions. He's claiming he was a manager who lost control of something that got away from him, which we expect is a partial truth designed to minimize his own culpability. She paused. But even a partial truth from someone who was in the room is significant. He wants a deal, Emily said. He wants reduced exposure. Whether he gets it depends on what he actually provides and what the congressional inquiry decides to do with its own process. Harwell's voice was measured. Emily, I'm telling you this because you're the cooperating witness whose actions precipitated this entire sequence, and you have a right to know what's happening. I'm also telling you because the names he may provide could include people whose connection to your own history we haven't fully established yet, and I want you to be prepared for the possibility that what you learn from this is not only about Vaughn. Emily set her coffee cup down on the counter. Are you telling me there's something in my record that connects to Oswell's network more directly than we've established? I'm telling you we don't fully know yet, Harwell said, and I wanted you to hear that from me before you heard it from someone else. She spent the rest of that day doing things that had nothing to do with the investigation, cleaning her apartment, calling her landlord about the water stain which he promised to address, and probably wouldn't, going to the grocery store, making dinner. She was deliberate about it, because the alternative was sitting inside a situation she couldn't control any faster than it was already moving, and she'd learned the hard way that there was a difference between tracking a situation carefully and turning it over and over until it occupied everything. The water stain was getting slightly larger. She photographed it for documentation purposes. Oswell's cooperation sessions began on a Thursday and produced, over the following 72 hours, a volume of information that the IG's office characterized internally as extensive. Emily knew this because Harwell called her Friday evening. He named 4 additional officers, Harwell said. 2 of them are still active. Both have been placed on administrative hold pending investigation. One of them is currently stationed at a base in the Pacific Theater and is being recalled. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. And my record? A pause that was 1 beat too long. Oswell confirmed that the restriction request on your file was initiated at his direction, Harwell said. He says he was given your name by someone who served in an advisory capacity to the command structure and who raised concerns about your operational background, creating complications for certain personnel decisions that were being managed. She paused on the word managed in a way that carried everything she wasn't saying. He says he doesn't know the full context of why your name was flagged. He says he acted on the advisory without seeking clarification. Someone above Oswell gave him my name, Emily said. That's what he's claiming. Do you believe him? Harwell was quiet for a moment. I believe he's telling a version of the truth that serves his interests. Whether the person above him actually exists or is a deflection strategy, we're working to establish. A pause. There's something else. In reviewing Oswell's communications from the period when the restriction request was filed, investigators found a reference to a meeting, an informal meeting not documented in official records between Oswell and two individuals described in the communication as medical review representatives. She paused again, and this time the pause was different, more deliberate, more careful. The communication references a review of medical separation determinations and specifically mentions personnel with, quote, operationally sensitive background, end quote, as a category requiring additional oversight before civilian reassignment. Emily was very still. He's saying my separation was reviewed, she said, that someone looked at where I ended up and made a decision about it. We don't know what decisions were made, Harwell said quickly. We don't know if this constitutes any improper conduct or if it was a legitimate oversight mechanism that was misapplied. We're looking at it. But someone tracked where I went after I left the service, Emily said. It appears that someone took an interest, Harwell said carefully. Yes. Emily stood up from her kitchen chair. She walked to the window. She looked at the water tower in the distance, lit up orange by the evening light, completely ordinary, the kind of thing you looked at when you needed something outside your own head to anchor to. She had spent 3 years at Iron Vale thinking she was anonymous, thinking she had stepped out of one world and into another, and that the passage between them was clean. She'd taken a civilian job in a hospital that was adjacent to a military installation. She hadn't done that by accident. She'd wanted the proximity, even if she'd told herself other things about why. And she'd kept her head down and done her work, and thought that the envelope in the bottom drawer was the only thing connecting her to what she'd been before. But she hadn't been anonymous. She'd been tracked. And she'd been placed somewhere, or allowed to remain somewhere, by people whose reasons she still didn't fully understand, near an installation that was connected to a command structure that had been managed for years by a man who knew her name. She thought about the day she'd been assigned to Riverside Field. Harold Skeeter with his clipboard, "You're on the rotation," a name on a list and a slot to fill. She'd assumed it was routine. She'd assumed a lot of things. She turned away from the window. Her phone showed a notification she hadn't seen come in. A message from her JAG attorney, time-stamped 12 minutes ago, marked urgent. She opened it. The message was 3 sentences. The first said that investigators reviewing Oswell's communications had identified a secondary document, a personnel routing recommendation from approximately 2.5 years ago, that assigned civilian contractor preference to Iron Vale Military Hospital. The second said the recommendation was attached to her name specifically. The third sentence said the recommendation had been signed by an individual whose current position was Senior Medical Oversight Advisor to the Army Surgeon General's office. Emily read it twice. The civilian woman from Harwell's meeting, the one who hadn't given her last name. She pulled up the IG's public staff directory, the Army Surgeon General's public-facing organizational chart, cross-referenced it against the partial name she had and the role that had been described, and found what she was looking for in under 4 minutes. Dr. Norma Quast, Senior Medical Oversight Advisor, appointed 3 years and 2 months ago. The same week Emily's personnel routing recommendation had been filed. She called Harwell immediately. Harwell picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. "You already know," Emily said. "We identified it this afternoon," Harwell said. Her voice was tight in a way it hadn't been before. "Emily, I want to be clear that Dr. Quast's presence at our earlier meeting was not something I coordinated with knowledge of this connection. She was assigned to that meeting by the Surgeon General's office as a standard advisory participant. She was in the room," Emily said, "when you told me about the investigation scope, when I agreed to cooperate formally." "Yes." "She knew everything I agreed to, everything I told you." A pause. "Yes," Harwell said. "She did." Emily looked at the message on her phone. The 3 sentences. The name at the bottom of a document that had placed her at Iron Vale, near a command structure that was rotten, in a position where she was either a liability to be managed or a variable that someone had decided to position and then wait on. She still didn't know which one. "Harwell," she said. "Who exactly was I working for when I was at Iron Vale?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. "That," Harwell said, "is what I need you to come in and help us figure out." She was back in the federal building by 9 the following morning. This time, the room was different. More people, more rank, a quiet tension in the air that hadn't been present in any of the previous meetings. The kind of tension that accumulated when an investigation had been running long enough that the people responsible for it could feel the shape of what it was becoming and were not entirely certain they were ready for it. Harwell was at the head of the table. Trent and Corfield from the IG's office were there. Her JAG attorney was to her left. Two people she hadn't met before, both in civilian clothes, both with the particular quality of stillness that suggested backgrounds in intelligence or federal law enforcement, were at the far end of the table and introduced themselves only by name, no affiliation, which was an affiliation in itself. Dr. Norma Quast was not present. Emily noted that immediately and filed it. "Before we begin," Harwell said, "I want to address what you asked me last night directly and on the record." She looked at Emily steadily. "We do not believe you were wittingly placed at Ironvale as part of any surveillance or monitoring operation. We believe the routing recommendation that placed you there was made by Dr. Quast for reasons that were, at minimum, unauthorized and may constitute a significant breach of medical oversight authority. What those reasons were, whether it was monitoring, whether it was something else, is what this investigation is now focused on establishing." "At minimum, unauthorized," Emily said. "Yes." "What's the maximum?" Trent spoke from across the table. "We're looking at the possibility that Dr. Quast used her position in the Surgeon General's advisory structure to route personnel with classified medical histories into installations adjacent to command structures in which she had an undisclosed interest." She paused. "We don't yet know what that interest was. We're building the picture." Emily looked at the two people at the end of the table who hadn't provided affiliations. They were both watching her with the careful neutrality of people whose job it was to watch carefully. "Who are they?" she asked. "Representatives from an oversight body that I'm not in a position to name in this context," Harwell said. "They're here because what Quast may have done with medical routing authority intersects with federal statutes that are outside the IG's direct jurisdiction." Emily absorbed that. Federal statutes outside the Inspector General's jurisdiction. People who didn't name their affiliation. The specific shape of a situation that was larger than what had been presented to her in any single conversation. "I want to understand something," Emily said, "and I want a straight answer." Harwell nodded. "Was I the only one? The only person she routed this way?" A silence that lasted 3 seconds. "No," Trent said. "We've identified 4 others so far, all with classified or operationally sensitive medical histories, all placed at installations adjacent to command structures that were subsequently found to have conduct issues of varying severity." She paused. "You're the only one who filed a formal complaint that triggered an investigation. The others, for various reasons, didn't." Emily sat with that for a moment. 4 other people. 4 other service members who'd come out of difficult service histories and found themselves placed, by a routing recommendation they never saw, near situations they didn't understand they were adjacent to. "Did any of them get hurt?" she asked. Another silence. "One of them was administratively separated from her civilian position under circumstances we're re-examining," Trent said carefully. "The others were still assessing." Emily looked at the table in front of her. There was a water glass she hadn't touched. She picked it up and drank half of it. "What do you need from me?" she said. What they needed was detailed and took most of the morning to establish. She answered every question with the precision she'd learned to apply to difficult situations. Not more than what was asked, not less, no editorializing that would complicate the evidentiary record, but also no softening of what she actually knew. She was asked about her operational history in specific contexts she hadn't discussed in previous sessions. She was asked about personnel she'd worked with who might have had visibility into the circumstances of her medical separation. She was asked about Oswell, about the network, about Vaughn's behavior at Riverside Field in the context of the new information about Quast's routing recommendation. The two people at the end of the table asked 3 questions. Total, each one surgical and each one revealing, in the precision of its framing, a level of prior knowledge about the specifics of her service that she hadn't encountered even in the IG sessions. She didn't ask how they knew what they knew. She answered the questions. At 11:40, Harwell called a break. In the hallway, Emily's attorney found a corner and pulled her into it. "How are you doing?" she said. "Fine." "I mean, actually." Emily looked at her. The attorney, her name was Sonia Baird, and she had short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of directness that Emily had found immediately useful, was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who was asking a professional question wrapped in a human one. "I'm functioning," Emily said, "which is what I know how to do." "What Trent said about the others," Baird said quietly. "That landed." "Yes." "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not right now." She paused. "But I might later." Baird nodded. She didn't push. Emily had noticed that about her from the beginning. She knew when to leave space. They went back in. The afternoon session produced the development that shifted everything from investigation into consequence. At 2:17, Trent received something on her phone, looked at it, looked at Corfield, and then at Harwell. "Dr. Quast has been detained," she said. The room was quiet. 40 minutes ago, she was attempting to access a federal records system using credentials that were not her own. Trent set the phone down. The access attempt was flagged by the system's security protocol. When agents arrived to speak with her, she did not comply initially. A pause. "She's currently in federal custody." Emily looked at the water glass. So Quast had known that the investigation was moving toward her, because she'd been in that first meeting with Harwell, because she'd heard Emily agree to full cooperation, because she'd been present while the scope was laid out, and had calculated that whatever was in the record system she'd tried to access was more dangerous to her than the risk of being caught trying to reach it. People made that calculation when they were desperate, and they were desperate when the thing they were trying to protect was large enough that losing it felt like losing everything. "What was she trying to access?" Emily asked. "We don't know yet," Trent said. "The attempt was blocked before it completed." "Do you know whose credentials she was using?" A pause. "They were registered to a deceased former medical officer," Trent said, "someone who served in an oversight capacity in the Surgeon General's office approximately 8 years ago." Emily thought about that. She thought about the specific effort it took to obtain and retain login credentials for someone who had been dead long enough that the account should have been deactivated. That wasn't impulsive. That was maintained. That was someone who had been keeping a particular door unlocked for a very long time against the possibility that she might one day need to run through it. The meeting concluded at 4. Emily drove home in the early evening traffic, and this time she didn't think tactically on the drive. She turned the radio on, something she almost never did. She wasn't sure why she did it now, and half listened to a station playing older music she didn't know the names of, and let her mind rest in the particular way it could rest, when there was nothing immediate left to do and all the motion was elsewhere. She was home by 5:30. She ate something. She sat on her couch. The thing she'd been holding at a functional distance all day came and found her, the way it usually did, in the quiet. 4 other people, routed to places they didn't understand by a woman who'd used medical oversight authority as something else entirely. One of them administratively separated under circumstances being re-examined, which meant at minimum one person who'd lost something real, possibly more than that, without ever knowing why. She thought about Veda Marsh, 23, filing a complaint that got closed in 8 days, spending 2 years believing she'd done something wrong. She thought about Petra, sending a 3-word text at the exact moment Vaughn was arrested, the relief in the compression of those 3 words. She thought about the soldier in the pre-op wing whose hands had been shaking before his procedure, and about how she'd sat with him. Not because anyone asked her to, but because he was alone, and she could see the fear in him, and she knew from experience that sometimes the most useful thing one person could do for another was simply not leave. She wasn't sure when she fell asleep on the couch, but she woke up at 2 in the morning with a crick in her neck and the lights still on, and a message from Baird on her phone that read, "Call me when you're up. Good news." And then a second message sent 40 minutes later, "Actually call me now if you're awake." "It's significant," she called. "Quast is cooperating," Baird said. She sounded like she'd been awake for hours, which she probably had. "She flipped in under 4 hours of federal custody. She's provided a full account." Emily said nothing. "Emily." Baird's voice was careful, but underneath the carefulness, there was something else. "The routing recommendation wasn't monitoring. It wasn't what we thought." A pause. Quast was running something she called an integration study. Her words, not ours. She identified service members with classified operational backgrounds and high-competency medical training who had been medically separated and placed them at installations adjacent to command structures she had assessed as having oversight problems. Another pause. Her stated rationale, and I want to be clear, this is her account and we're still evaluating it, was that she believed high-competency medical personnel with tactical backgrounds who were operating in civilian roles would, by their nature, be more likely to identify and report misconduct than standard civilian staff. Emily was completely still. She thought she was doing something useful, she said. She thought she was doing something useful in a way that violated about 15 different statutes, bypassed the rights of the individuals she was routing, used medical authority for a purpose it doesn't exist for, and exposed every person she placed to risks she had no right to expose them to without their knowledge or consent. Baird's voice was steady. Her intentions don't mitigate the conduct, but they explain the conduct. Emily sat on the edge of her couch in the 2 a.m. quiet of her apartment and thought about Dr. Norma Quast, who had apparently believed she was solving a problem and had constructed an entire unauthorized system around that belief, routing human beings like variables in a study they'd never agreed to participate in. The others, Emily said, the 4. Investigators are reaching out to all of them. The one who was administratively separated, her case is already flagged for immediate review. There's a real possibility that her separation was the direct result of being placed in a situation she wasn't prepared for and wasn't told she was in, and that the conduct that led to her separation was, at least in part, a response to that situation. Baird paused. We're going to know a lot more in the next week. What happens to Quast? Federal charges. Multiple counts. She's cooperating, which affects sentencing but doesn't eliminate the charges. A pause. Emily, you are not a subject of investigation. You are not implicated in any aspect of Quast's program. Your cooperation throughout this process has been exemplary, and the outcomes of this investigation, the Vaughn charges, the network exposure, the congressional inquiry, and now Quast, would not exist without the initial action you took at Riverside Field. She paused again. I want you to hear that clearly. Emily heard it. She thanked Baird and ended the call and sat in the dark for a while longer, not thinking about anything specific, just breathing. In the morning, she went for a run. Shorter than usual, 5 miles, easy pace, the neighborhood quiet in the early hour, the air carrying the first suggestion that September was approaching and the brutal Georgia summer was beginning to finally, reluctantly, loosen its hold. She ran past the water tower. She ran past the grocery store. She ran past the park, where 2 older men were already playing chess at the concrete tables near the entrance, which they apparently did every morning, regardless of weather or news or the weight of the world, which she found, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, genuinely steadying. She came home. She showered. She made coffee. She drank it. The court-martial proceedings against Major Derek Vaughn began on a Tuesday in late September, 61 days after Riverside Field. Emily testified on the 3rd day. She wore civilian clothes because she was a civilian witness, and she sat in the witness chair and answered the questions put to her by the prosecution with the same flat, ordered precision she'd brought to every session of every investigation. And when the defense counsel attempted to characterize her response at the ceremony as provocative and her request to review her own personnel file as an act of deliberate antagonism, she answered those questions with the same precision and let the audio recording from the installation's communication archive do the work that she didn't need to do herself. The recording was played in full. The courtroom was quiet during it. The specific quality of that quiet, the way people went still when they were hearing something that confirmed a thing they already knew but hadn't heard made real in someone's actual voice, was something Emily registered from the witness stand without reacting to it visibly. She'd learned that from the field. The ability to register everything and show only what was useful. Vaughn's defense lasted 2 days and produced nothing that the audio record didn't immediately contradict. The witnesses the defense called were limited in number and limited in usefulness, which told Emily that the people Vaughn had relied on for protection had either already been charged themselves, had cooperated with the IG, or had made the calculation that appearing as a defense witness in a court-martial with this level of visibility was not something their careers could survive. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all counts. Article 128, assault consummated by battery, abuse of authority, obstruction of a military investigation, conduct unbecoming an officer. Emily was not in the room when it was read. She was at her apartment, and Baird called her within 2 minutes of the announcement with a voice that was professionally controlled and clearly pleased underneath the professionalism. Guilty on all 4 counts, Baird said. Sentencing? Emily asked. 30 days out, the additional charges from the IG investigation are being folded into the sentencing recommendation. He's looking at dismissal from service, possible federal confinement, and full forfeiture of retirement benefits. Emily sat down at her kitchen table. The others, she said, from the network. Lieutenant Colonel Pendergrass's cooperation agreement is in place. He's providing testimony in the congressional inquiry in exchange for reduced administrative penalties. 2 of the officers named in the expanded investigation have been formally charged. One has entered a guilty plea, one is contesting. Oswell's cooperation has been partially accepted. He's facing administrative separation and a civil suit from 2 of the service members who filed complaints that were buried under his command. Baird paused. He's not going to walk away from this clean. Nobody in that network is. And Quast? Federal arraignment next month. She's maintained her cooperation. The charges are serious. Unauthorized use of medical authority, privacy violations, endangerment of federal personnel, accessing government systems under false credentials. She's looking at significant federal penalties. Baird paused. Her attorney is arguing that her cooperation and her stated intent, however badly implemented, should be considered mitigating factors. The prosecution disagrees. Emily thought about Quast for a moment, about the specific, strange, uncomfortable complexity of a person who had done something genuinely harmful for reasons that were not entirely without logic, just without ethics, without authorization, and without the basic human acknowledgement that the people she was routing were people who deserved to know what they were being placed in the middle of. The 4 others, Emily said, all have been formally contacted. All are being offered comprehensive legal support and advocacy through a process the IG's office and the JAG Corps are jointly managing. The woman who was administratively separated, her name is Sergeant First Class Delilah Torn, her case is being fast-tracked for review. Early indications from the review board are favorable. A pause. She called the JAG office 2 days ago and asked if she could contact you. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Give her my number, she said. Tournay called that evening. She was 31, and her voice on the phone had the quality of someone who'd been holding something very heavy for a long time and was only just beginning to understand that she might be allowed to put it down. She'd been separated 18 months ago. She'd been told her separation was the result of conduct during a period of high stress that had led to incidents that couldn't be overlooked. She'd believed it. She'd spent 18 months in a civilian life she didn't feel she'd chosen, working a job she was good at but didn't feel right in, carrying a version of herself that she'd been told was the true one, the one that broke under pressure, the one that couldn't hold it together, and trying to build something livable around it. She didn't talk for very long. 40 minutes, about half of which was silence that Emily held without filling. At the end, Torn said, "How did you know to keep going, when nobody believed you were what you knew you were?" Emily thought about it honestly, the way she'd thought about Marcia's question. "I'm not sure I always knew," she said. "There were days where I just kept moving because stopping felt worse. That's not the same thing as knowing." She paused. "But I think I believed that the record existed, that what I'd actually done was somewhere, in some form, and that eventually the distance between what I knew to be true and what other people believed would close. Not automatically, not without cost." She paused again. "You have to be the one who makes it close." Torn was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I can do what you did," she said. "You don't have to do what I did," Emily said. "The situation is different now. You have people, you have documentation, you have a process that's already moving." She paused. "What you have to do is decide that the version of you that they put in your file isn't the final version. That's the only decision. The rest is process." There was a long pause on the line. "Okay," Torn said quietly. "Okay," Emily said. The formal acknowledgement, the one Harwell had promised, the one the Army's Public Affairs Office had been coordinating with the IG, came on a Wednesday in October, 8 weeks after the court-martial verdict. It arrived not as a press release, which would have been easy to miss, but as a formal statement read into the record of the Congressional Armed Services Subcommittee inquiry by Brigadier General Harwell in her capacity as a senior Army medical oversight official. Emily watched it from her apartment on a laptop, because she'd been asked if she wanted to attend and had said no. The statement was 3 minutes long. It covered the nature of her service, the circumstances of her medical separation, described specifically and accurately for the first time in any public forum as injuries sustained during a classified operation in which she performed exceptional medical service under direct fire, the unauthorized suppression of her personnel record, and the Army's formal acknowledgement that the treatment of her record and her professional reputation over the preceding 3 years constituted an institutional failure that did not reflect the service she had provided or the character she had demonstrated. Harwell read it without inflection, in the precise tone of someone delivering an official document, and the subcommittee members in the frame behind her were quiet in a way that suggested they understood the weight of what was being said. Emily's left side ached slightly. She'd been sitting on the couch for too long. She shifted, stretched, and kept watching. When it was done, she closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the ordinary silence of her ordinary apartment, the September light coming through the window at the angle it came through at this time of day, the water stain in the upper corner of the wall still there because the landlord still hadn't done anything about it, the boxes in the bedroom corner that she hadn't unpacked because she'd been waiting for something she hadn't been able to name. She knew what it was now. She'd been waiting for the thing that had just happened, the acknowledgement, the closing of the distance between what she knew to be true and what the record said. It hadn't felt the way she'd expected it to feel in the moments just after. She'd expected something sharper, more immediate. What she felt instead was something quieter, a settling, like the specific way tension left a muscle that had been contracted so long it had almost forgotten what released felt like. She got up and went to the bedroom. She opened the boxes. The proposal that Harwell had brought to the first formal meeting, the one Emily had taken 48 hours to consider, the one her attorney had walked her through in careful detail, had been formally accepted 3 weeks after the court-martial verdict. Emily had signed the agreement on a Thursday morning and had not made a production of it. The Combat Medical Training Initiative, a new program within Army Medical Command designed to establish standardized training and support protocols for combat medics, transitioning from active duty into both continued military service and civilian medical roles. Emily's role was not ceremonial. She wasn't being installed as a figurehead to pose for photographs and then have nothing to do. She had been brought in specifically because the people who designed the program understood, from reading her file and watching how she'd operated across 3 months of an investigation that had expanded 5 times, that what the program actually needed in its leadership was not someone who would manage it from a distance, but someone who would work inside it. She would be working inside it. That had been her one firm condition. She reported to the Army Medical Command facility in Atlanta 3 weeks after signing. Her first day was a Tuesday. She arrived 7 minutes early, found the office she'd been assigned, noted that the chair was wrong for the desk height, and made a mental note to request a different one, and went to the briefing that had been scheduled for that morning. There were 8 people in the room: program staff, 2 medical educators, a retired Special Forces medic named Aldwin, who had been recruited as a training consultant and who she'd been told was excellent and also occasionally difficult, which she found immediately reassuring, and a young woman named Britta, who was a first-year program coordinator and who shook Emily's hand with the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone who had read something about the person in front of her and wasn't sure what to do with the gap between the document and the reality. "You don't need to treat me like the file," Emily said to Britta, quietly, as the briefing was being set up. "I'm going to be here every day. I'm going to be annoying about documentation, and I'm going to eat lunch at my desk too often. You'll forget about the file pretty quickly." Britta blinked, and then, tentatively, she smiled. The first cohort of the program, 42 combat medical veterans in various stages of transition, some moving to continued service roles, some moving into civilian medicine, some not yet certain which direction they were going, arrived in November. Emily stood at the front of a room that was not dramatic, that had fluorescent lighting and chairs that scraped on the floor and a projector that took too long to connect. And she looked at 42 people who were carrying, in various configurations, the specific weight of having done something difficult in service of something larger, and then found themselves on the other side of it, trying to figure out what came next. She didn't give a speech. She'd been asked if she wanted to, and she'd said no. What she gave them was the same thing she'd given that soldier in the pre-op wing whose hands had been shaking. Her actual presence, her actual attention, the simple and radical commitment of not leaving. She told them the program structure. She told them what the first 3 weeks would look like. She answered questions, And some of the questions were the kind of questions people asked when they were really asking something else. And she answered both the stated question and the one underneath it, because she'd spent enough time around people in transition to know the difference. At the end, she said one thing that wasn't on the agenda. Somewhere along the way, someone probably told you that the version of yourself that got through whatever you got through doesn't translate. That what you built in the field or in the operating room or in the situations nobody talks about openly doesn't apply out here. She paused. That's wrong. What you built is the most applicable thing you have. What this program is trying to do is help you figure out the translation, not replace the original. She looked at them. That's the only thing I want you to take from today. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Aldwin, from the side of the room, said, So the projector situation, is that going to be addressed, or are we all just living with this? The room laughed, and the spell broke in exactly the way it needed to break, and the work began. The sentencing in Vaughn's case came on a November morning. Emily was in a training session and learned about it on her phone during the break. Dismissal from service, the military equivalent of dishonorable discharge for an officer. 18 months of federal confinement. Full forfeiture of all retirement benefits and military pay. His security clearances were permanently revoked. His record would carry the court-martial conviction for the duration of whatever followed. She read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back into the training session. Oswald's civil settlement was announced the following week. A financial judgment in favor of 2 of the service members whose complaints had been buried under his command. The amounts not publicly disclosed, but characterized by their attorney as significant. His cooperation agreement with the IG had kept him from criminal charges. But the civil judgment, the administrative separation, and the public record of his conduct in the 34th had a permanence that no cooperation agreement could fully neutralize. He had been the architect of a system built to protect certain people at the expense of others, and that system was now part of the documented record of a congressional inquiry. Lieutenant Colonel Pendergrass, having cooperated fully, received reduced administrative penalties, a formal letter of reprimand, loss of 1 grade, forced retirement. He would not face criminal charges. Whether justice looked like that from every angle was a question Emily held without needing to resolve. He had been in a system that made certain choices easier than others, and he'd made those choices, and then he'd made a different choice when the opportunity presented itself. People were not simple. Dr. Norma Quast entered a guilty plea to 3 of the 7 federal charges in December. The remaining 4 were dismissed as part of the plea agreement. She was sentenced to 3 years of federal supervision, a substantial financial penalty, and a permanent bar from any position involving medical oversight authority at the federal level. Her cooperation had been genuine and comprehensive, and it had mattered, and she was still going to spend 3 years under federal supervision for what she'd done with a system she'd never had the right to build. The other officer from the network who had contested the charges, a man named Colonel Herrick, went through a full court-martial proceeding in January. Emily was not called to testify in that proceeding. She followed it from a distance, through the updates her attorney forwarded. He was found guilty on 2 of 4 charges and sentenced to administrative separation. His attorney appealed. The appeal was still pending as of March. These things took time. They didn't resolve in clean arcs. They ground forward through process and paperwork and the specific bureaucratic friction of institutions trying to correct themselves while still being institutions. And the results were imperfect, which was the nature of results. Delilah Torn's administrative separation was formally overturned in February. The review board found that the circumstances of her separation had been materially affected by her placement in a situation that she had not been informed of and had not consented to, and that the conduct cited in her separation documentation could not be fairly evaluated without that context. She was offered reinstatement at her previous grade with back pay for the period of her separation. She called Emily when she found out. She didn't say much. She said, "It's overturned." And then she was quiet for a moment, and Emily waited. And then Torn said, "I keep thinking about what you said, that you have to be the one who makes it close." Another pause. "I didn't think I was going to be able to do it." "You did, though," Emily said. "We did," Torn said. Emily let that sit for a moment without correcting it, because Torn was right, and because sometimes the right thing to do with a correction was to leave it unmade. The water stain in the apartment ceiling got addressed in March, 3 months after Emily had called the landlord again and sent him a photograph and followed up twice more. He sent someone who patched it imperfectly, so there was still a faint ghost of it visible in certain light, which Emily decided she could live with. The boxes in the bedroom corner were unpacked by February. Not all at once, on a Saturday morning over 2 hours with music playing. And the things inside them found places in the apartment, on shelves and in drawers, and in the corner of the bedroom where the boxes used to be. The apartment started to look like somewhere a person lived rather than somewhere a person was passing through. She kept the manila envelope in the bottom drawer. She didn't look at it often, but she stopped thinking of it as the thing she was carrying and started thinking of it as the thing that was hers. The documentation of something she'd done and survived and built herself from, which was not a burden and was not a trophy, but was simply the record. Her record. Correct and complete, and in no one else's hands. In April, she drove out to Riverside Field. Not for any official purpose. The installation was open to contractors, and she had the credentials. She drove through the gate in the late afternoon and parked near the eastern edge of the parade ground and got out and stood there for a while, looking at the field. It was empty. The grass had recovered from whatever the ceremony had done to it. The medical tent positions were gone, no trace of them left in the flat Georgia landscape. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes. She wasn't looking for anything specific, and she didn't feel the thing she'd half expected to feel. Something cinematic, some sense of the place speaking back to her. It was just a field. The thing that had happened there had happened to her and to a number of other people, and it had moved outward in ways that could not be unmoved, and the field itself was indifferent to all of that, which was correct, which was how it should be. She thought about what she'd told Torn. You have to be the one who makes it close. She thought about the 47 minutes in a compound in a place that officially had no American medical personnel in it, and the 3 soldiers she'd gotten out, and the choice she'd made to keep working while her left side was telling her in very clear terms to stop. She had not made that choice because it was clean or because she was certain how it would go. She'd made it because the alternative was that people who were alive stopped being alive, and that math was still the clearest math she knew. It applied to the operating room and to the parade ground and to every phone call she'd had over the past 5 months with people who'd been told to stay quiet and had finally stopped staying quiet. The math was always the same. The people in front of you are alive right now. What you do next has consequences. You do the thing that keeps them that way, even if it costs you something, even if nobody sees it, even if the file that gets written afterward doesn't say it correctly. She drove back to Atlanta in the early evening. Traffic was heavy going into the city, which it always was. She sat in it without impatience, listening to the radio, watching the sun go down in her mirrors in shades of orange that turned the red clay of the highway shoulder into something almost beautiful. She had a training session the next morning. The second cohort, 38 people, different configuration than the first, some of them carrying harder histories. She'd been reviewing their intake materials the previous week. There was a lot of work to do. She was looking forward to it. That was the thing she kept coming back to. In the quiet moments, in the early mornings before the runs, in the evenings when the apartment was settled and the city made its distant sounds outside the window. Not the vindication, though it was real, and it mattered, and she wasn't going to pretend it didn't. Not the public acknowledgement, or the court-martial verdict, or the sight of a corrupt network dismantled piece by piece through the slow machinery of accountability. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the thing that stayed with her, the thing that felt most true in the quiet, was simpler than any of it. It was the work, the actual work, in an actual room, with actual people who were trying to figure out how to carry what they'd built into the lives they were still building. The work that didn't care about your record, or your history, or what anyone had said about you in a hallway or on a parade ground. The work that only cared about whether you showed up, and whether you were honest, and whether you understood that the person across from you deserved your full attention, not because they'd earned it in some transactional sense, but because they were there, and they were trying, and that was enough. She had spent 3 years waiting to be seen correctly. The thing she understood now, not neatly, not without cost, but genuinely, was that she had never actually disappeared. The woman they'd tried to make small had kept showing up, in civilian scrubs in a hospital hallway, in a medical tent on a parade ground, in an interrogation room, in a federal building conference room, on a phone call at 2 a.m. with a woman who needed to hear that the version of herself the file described was not the final version. She had kept showing up. That was the whole of it. That was the only lesson she knew how to teach. You keep showing up. You do the work in front of you. You refuse to be reduced to the smallest version of yourself that other people find convenient. Not because it's easy. It is not easy. It costs something real every time. But because the alternative is disappearing, and disappearing is the one thing that genuinely cannot be undone. She drove through the city as the lights came on, and the evening traffic thinned and the skyline held the last of the light against a sky that was going purple and then dark. She had a parking space that was sometimes taken by the neighbor in 4B, and she had a landlord who fixed things badly and too late. And she had an apartment that finally looked like somewhere a person lived, and a drawer with an envelope in it that said the true things about her in language that was now part of the official record. She had work to do in the morning,